How are you? Good
Hello.
morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night for the last time. So, welcome to the 12th day of the School for Think Tankers. I'm really glad to see all of you here early in the morning, at midday, or in the evening, wherever you are. We're excited to have you all here and to be equally happy and sad to be wrapping up the school. I think it's been 2 intense weeks, and I think I'm gonna miss seeing you each other, seeing you every day at the start of my day. I hope we had a great you had a great experience as well. And today we're going to have two sessions. It's going to be first a wrap up workshop from Kike called How to Set Up a Think Tank, which the name might be a bit misleading because it's much more than that. It's a integrative work that encompasses everything that we've kind of done and gives way to a lot of questions that outstanding questions that you might have had. So I do think about the any outstanding questions that you have that have not been able we've not been able to resolve throughout the school, and this is the day to ask that. Maybe not to solve everything, but to see where we can select you. Not select is not the word. Direct, direct, and support your continuous learning. Because as Donnie was saying at the beginning, there's a lot. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of things that you need to know, and there's also we also need time to digest it. With that, I don't think Kiki needs any more introduction because we've met before. So there, off you go, Kiki. Over to you.
So hi, it's nice to see you all, and thank you for having endured the last couple of weeks of discussions around think tanks. So what we tend to do this in this session is we try to I try to provide what I like to think of as out of date summary of what we've discussed, and the reason why I say out of date is that the speakers and the trainers every year bring in new ideas, and so I don't get a chance to update my presentation, but I'll do it for next one. What we'll do is we'll discuss some of the main components of what you've discussed over the last couple of weeks, with maybe some additional information, but hopefully it'll give you a chance to reflect on them as well. So I'm going to walk through a series of questions that we can ask ourselves when we're thinking about starting a think tank, or we're thinking about working in a think tank, or reforming, restructuring, relaunching a think tank, or simply just getting on with everyday life at the organization. So as Andrea says, it's not necessarily just for starting a think tank. It's really just for working in a think tank. I'll go through a lot of these questions, and at every question, this is an opportunity for us to stop for a little bit and discuss. So I might not address every single slide in my deck, but it's there for you to refer to later on, look for information or comment on. So I'm going to have a few moments during the presentation where I'll ask you to come in and join in and ask questions, offer your ideas, your advice, your own reflections. But please feel free to interrupt me if you want to say something. I will have my the chat box open as I go. So if you comment, I should see it, and if you raise your hand, I should see it. But if I don't, Andrea, please just send me a little ping or something, just to let me know that somebody wants to talk. I see a couple more people joining, so I'm going to start my presentation as they join. All right, setting up a think tank. Although I've just said to you, it's not about setting up a think tank, it's about working in a think tank. So what are the things we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about the fact that think tanks are a product of their context, and at the same time a reaction to it. So I think that I stressed at the beginning of this school, I stressed this idea that think tanks in different parts of the world are going to be different. But at the same time, those creating think tanks or founding think tanks tend to be reacting to the context. They think something is missing, something is not working well. And we see a lot of young people setting up think tanks nowadays. They're doing it in a way to respond to the way that think tanks operate nowadays. And so they want to create something new business model, for example. So there might be some outliers in every context. They're likely to be. We talked about evidence-informed policy, and at least I try to make the case that it's a flawed approach, but it's valuable. It helps us to frame our work. I refer to the moral reasoning behind it, and I think the point I was trying to make is that it's not just a very technocratic sort of act or something. It's just it's also value based. It's very political as well. So everything a think tank does is about politics. There isn't a recipe to set up a think tank or manage a think tank or reboot a think tank. I think that the most important approach is to engage in dialogue with your peers, those others who are setting up, leading, working in think tanks, but also within the organization. So this is more about thinking, planning, starting, and adapting your think tank than anything else. But let me start with this. What have we learned? And so I'm going to give you, I think you're by now used to this tool, Menti, and this is the code. So why don't we, so I've got a little mosquito that is decided to join me this morning. And so I wonder if you can go into this link, menti.com, and just type in this code, and we will, I'll ask you to answer these two questions. What have you learned that you were hoping to learn, and what have you learned that has been unexpected? I'd like to start with that as a way of getting a sense of where we are. And I'm sure that Andrea will ask you similar questions later on today. So what have you learned that you were hoping to learn, and what have you learned that has been unexpected? I'm going to switch to governance and funding models for a think tank, a real life challenges. A bit more on challenges of managing governance and think tanks. So you learned a little bit more. Is that what you mean? Yes. If anything was unexpected, please note it. Maybe say unexpected, and then the lesson learned about branding. No, how broad the think tank is for the creation of a think tank. Unexpected, how important context is for the way think tanks work and are set up. I was hoping and learn how to run a volunteer-based think tank. Unexpected, communications and mail framework strategies, way more than I initially thought. Okay. Unexpected, such detailed guidance towards branding. Yes, branding is something we've all learned later on in life. Even those of us have been working in and studying think tanks for a while. Expected, importance of communications, branding and communication. Finance for non-financing managers and Mel was most valuable. Anyone else going to unexpected, the importance of storytelling to find support and validation. Unexpected, think tanks like any other organization are evolving. So it was interesting to see how organizations have evolved into think tanks and how think tanks continue to evolve. Understanding a foundation of think tanks, the politics of it, and how to make them effective. Unexpected, similar challenges even with large established think tanks. That was unexpected to me as well. Every time that we hear from Lisa or from Keith, I get feeling that large think tanks are struggling with many of the same challenges that smaller think tanks, medium-sized think tanks are struggling with. Unexpected to find other think tanks with so similar mandates, and as in think and do for government support, like Grupo Faro. Okay, so I think these cover all of the issues that we've discussed. Probably not so much related to research, but certainly everything else, right? Communications, governance, management, finance, M&E, and to some extent, I'm not surprised. I think that most of us come to the world of think tanks with some understanding of research and some appreciation of research, some experience of having worked in research. but not necessarily with the experience of having worked in these other very important areas of the think tank. Um, you might have seen an article I wrote for on think tanks for the website called I think how to set up a think tank step-by-step approach. I don't know if Andre you can share it, or Christina on the chat. We took that article and kind of rethought, redid it, and Andrea suggested these questions that we can ask ourselves about think tanks. Why questions, what questions, who questions, how questions, and when questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these set of questions as a way of trying to reflect about some of the things we've learned over these couple of weeks. The why questions will lead to what questions and how questions. So it's not an exact sort of division of questions, but it'll certainly help us out. So yes, that article is the one I sent to everybody who emails us asking for advice on setting up a think tank. I send them that article first. And I say, if you find everything you need to know in that article, then you don't need to hire us or ask us for help. But otherwise, we'll be happy to. So why questions? The first question I think we all need to ask ourselves is, why do you want to set up a think tank? Or why do you want to work in a think tank? And I like to stress that issues, the reasons why you might want to do this vary from the very mundane to the very ideal, to the very high-minded, and to the very unethical. And I think we need to accept that all of them are somewhat valid. By unethical, I mean there are certainly think tanks out there, and there are funders out there that are creating think tanks, at least in the way they're branded, to shift debates away from what the evidence suggests, to undermine democratic processes, etc. But some questions that I think we should be asking ourselves to address this larger question about about why we want to work in a think tank. What is the problem that you want to address? What sorts of challenges or improvements are you aiming to achieve? What needs to be done or what needs to happen for this to change? What types of activities would you like to do? Who do you want to influence? Who do you want to work with? I think all of these questions are going to help you decide whether what you need is a think tank. Maybe you need an NGO, an advocacy campaign, or an advocacy organization. Maybe you'll be okay with just publishing a blog or a newsletter that is now becoming quite popular again. Maybe you're okay working in an academic institution. You should go into politics. There are many ways in which you can bring about change. A think tank is just one of them. And I should say, it's usually the least powerful approach. Think tanks, as you know, we've discussed before, fall in between fields. So they're not the most established one of those fields. And so the challenges are many, as you've heard from the speakers over the last couple of weeks. So if you really, really want to establish a think tank, or work in a think tank, or develop a think tank, I advise that you have a very good reason. And it could be very mundane, right? It could be a way of generating income. It could be that you're a bit tired of teaching at university and you'd rather work in a space where you can focus on research. It might be that the organization you're working on is a bit too bureaucratic and you want something that is lighter, just easier to work in. You might just want to work in a think tank. It might give you a sense of belonging, of achievement. That's fine. So, but be very sure about that. Are there any reasons, any things that you thought about over the last couple of weeks that would qualify as an answer to these questions? Please just share them in the chat if you have them. So we heard from Orazio Velletini, for example. Orazio he wanted to change the system. He felt that there was something missing in Ecuador, and he thought that one way of doing it was to create a new organization. He talked about. He says, I decided then to promote the creation of an organization that would focus on delivering innovative solutions for social problems. And he thought that the think tank was necessary. But if you read through his statement, you'll see that he wasn't just thinking about typical think tanks. He wanted a think tank that would promote citizen participation. that would encourage public-private collaboration to change the rules of the game. He thought about, he came from the world of social entrepreneurs. He'd been a member of Ashoka for a while. So the kind of think tank he was going to create was very much informed by that experience. This is another one, Simonida Carrasca. She had a different reason. I think she was thinking at the time of the founding of a think tank, she just completing her PhD. She was looking for a place to work. She was looking for a place where she could combine different skills and competencies that she had gained throughout her education. And she didn't feel that place existed in, where is she based? Is it in I don't want to say Serbia.
North Macedonia. Skopje.
Yes, Skopje. Yes, and so she, that was behind her. That was behind a lot of the decision, and that's very typical. Many of the think tanks we work with are an effort by the researchers to create a space where they can do the work they want to do. They're not thinking beyond that at the time of creating it. They just feel that in their context, there aren't any organizations that fit that mold that they're looking for. Right? So the reasons why you might want to create a think tank might vary, and they're all perfectly valid. And the reasons why you want to work in a think tank might vary, and they're all perfectly valid. We talked about what is a think tank. Do you open the microphones to anybody who wants to come in, but do you feel you now have the tools to describe a think tank very clearly to your families and friends, people who are not involved in the world of think tanks? Does anybody feel confident they can go around and say, yeah, I know what a think tank is, let me describe this to you, or I work for a think tank, this is what we are? Anybody would like to
Right.
Boyan, yeah.
So, I wanted to reflect on how I try to explain what I do to my mother, because occasionally every 3 or 4 months she would ask me, what is actually this you do? And then I would actually try to explain to her in terms of the things that we do, the activities. So it would be consultations, public events, actual research, writing, publishing. But the only thing that she actually kind of perceives from the outside, because she doesn't visit BCSP's website, is when I occasionally appear in the media. So she thinks that I'm some kind of a journalist or something along those lines still. But what I also think it's important for the think tanks is how we are perceived by the outsiders. I mean, aside from my mother, but for example, in Serbia, we have this huge issue of civil society sector at large being perceived as some kind of a foreign mercenary factor, some kind of traitor to the national cause, because we are mostly funded by donors from the outside. And also, again, this kind of think tank, meaning that we just think and we don't do much. So we are somehow shamed into adding think and do tank, for example, occasionally. So I think this is constant renegotiation with target groups, but also people at large, I mean, the society at large, about who we are and what is it that we wanted to achieve.
Yeah,
I didn't have any general, this is just some kind of, off the top of my head, nothing more structured to say.
I mean, I've been working in this field for a very long time. I study think tanks for a living, and my parents describe my work to their friends in every other way possible except what I actually do, or what the organizations I work with actually are. So I certainly recognize that feeling. Anybody else? Anybody feels they have a new way to describe their work or the work of think tanks to their mothers or fathers or cousins or friends?
Well, I'm Boyan's colleague.
Yelena, yes.
Sorry, I already started speaking.
Go ahead, and then I'll pass on to Donia.
I didn't notice, sorry. So, and it is quite hard to explain to people what is our job. Like, is it academic? I mean, people do not understand that you sit beside the computer and just do the research. And since Boyan already said that we have kind of a stigma of working against national interests, then I love to say that we monitor what the government does. We do the research that the government cannot afford to do. And then we try to use that knowledge to make our laws better.
Yeah. All right. And do you guys, I mean, both of you, do you use the label think tank? Because in some contexts, the label think tank is certainly not seen that well, you know, as in good eyes. So would you avoid using the label think tank when describing your organization?
Well, in Serbian, we do not use the word think tank because nobody would understood. We have a translation in Serbian, which is not quite, I mean, it's not quite perhaps correct, but it's how we want to call ourselves, and that is Independent Research Center.
Right.
So you can find on our website, I think, Independent Research Center in Serbian, but when it's written in English, then it's a think tank.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Donia, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say briefly that when I describe what I want to do in Tunisia, and given the context and it's very complicated right now, politically, socially, and economically, this may sound funny, but it's the truth. Everybody looks at me like I'm a kamikaze, you know, wanting to engage and try and do something about it. And particularly where it hurts the most, you know, going inside the government and trying to make things work. So this is another perception, and I'm learning to cope with it. It's like a challenge, but just wanted to put it out there. It makes me think also of the colleagues in Myanmar, by the way.
Yeah, I can't remember now if Simon Maxwell said, well, he always says that being a director of a think tank is one of the best jobs, but it's the most difficult job. Did he say that at his talk? I think in the video, he has in one of the videos we've recorded with him, he says this, right? It's the best job in the world, but it's also an impossible job. You're going to fail all the time. Carlos, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. So regarding your question, I would say that I would not be able to say what is a think tank. Because I think that one of my great insights from this winter school is that there are many possible ways to develop your think tank. So there are think tanks. There is no a think tank, and it makes this is very important for me at this stage because it means that there are many possible futures that we can build in this process. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We are just starting, and I have said I come from the recently from the world of innovation and entrepreneurship. So I've been doing always the parallel or of a startup, trying to find its place, pivoting and developing in these lean processes in which you test, design, and you finally at some time will find a position and a way to make things happen. But the core thing, I think, is think tanks want to influence societies and want to influence societies through evidence-informed pieces of thinking. Yeah. And we want to make it not only for policy makers, but also for those policymakers are at our institutional levels. My case is health system. So institutional levels, hospitals, even ourselves. And I'm convinced, and I will try to position, let's say, a focus that say policy making is something that you make at the level of the stage, but also at the level of agents of an ecosystem. And if you want to have influence, try to evidence inform all these policy makings, the actors of an ecosystem. Then we don't have to rely only in government policymakers.
Yeah, we're part of the policymaking ecosystem for sure, which means that from different points of view, different perspectives will understand the organization from their own points of view. So I'm going to put Diana on the spot here, but a couple of months ago we had an event in Peru where I invited Urbes Lab, Diana's think tank, but also I invited Redes, which is a new think tank with a lot more resources funded by the private sector. That is created what I like to call a sort of a think net. So rather than a think tank, actually this is Stephen Yeo's word, rather than a think tank with a lot of researchers in-house, what they do is they use researchers housed somewhere else, and what they're doing is they're focusing on the last mile. They are communicating the work these researchers have been working on in their own institutions, but they have a lot more resources. And you look at their website; it was done by Soapbox. They are kind of they're trying to establish themselves as a very dynamic, very communication-driven organization. Then we had Equilibrium Sende, which is a more traditional think tank, but with a very consultancy-driven approach, and they do a lot of analytical work. And they've been founded by a couple of Venezuelans living in Peru, and they work at the regional level. We had Urbes Lab, and then we had Lead Lab, which is a think tank focusing on sports, which is a very small operation, mostly about organizing events. So all 4 think tanks, relatively new think tanks. They're the young think tanks led by young people, but very different organizations. So created around the same time, but because of their origin, there are very different types of organizations. And I don't think they would have all described themselves as think tanks. Diana, I don't know if you guys probably did not describe yourselves as a think tank.
No, because we think we are more than research center than a think tank, or maybe in the future we will be or become a think tank. But for now, I think no is no.
But at the same time, you're different from a research center at a university, because you are quite active in trying to ensure that the research you do is used by policymakers, by the media, by the public. So it's taking up. So there are these levels, like graduations and shades of these organizations. Yes, Andreas has shared the articles of these think tanks that I mentioned. The only one that is not referenced there is Redes, but I'll write about them in a few weeks. So this was, yes, what is a think tank? I wasn't expecting we would end up with a final definition, but I like the suggestion that Carlos says that there's not one think tank, there are many think tanks. And to quote Jim McGann, although he says I never quote him, I'll see a think tank when I see one. I think that is the approach. You have to look at them one at a time. So let me go back to my presentation, and I'm going to ask you now to break out into smaller groups, because I want you to think about this. Why do you want to create a think tank? Why do you want to work in a think tank? And if not a think tank, if you decided you don't want a think tank, then what else? What is going to allow you to deliver your personal professional mission? Christine, I don't know if you can split us into small groups. So maybe groups of 4 would be great. And we'll just take ourselves, we'll take about 8 minutes, so just under 10 minutes for this discussion. And I might bring you back a little bit earlier. So go straight into it. Why do you want to create a think tank, and why do you want to work in a think tank? And if you don't, what else? What else could you do? What else would you like to do? Welcome back. So I'd like to hear from anybody who's decided this is not for me, or sorry, Edgar, you were cut off. I'd like to hear from anybody who decided this is not for me, or maybe there's another model out there that I and my organization should consider. Has anybody thought about that? Or are you all still think tank advocates?
I think I'd just like to say that what you were saying about, I'll see a think tank when I see a think tank, that kind of resonates, trying to figure out there are components of communications, of advocacy, of research, but also what you were sharing just now, I think about the Faro Group's director, about bringing innovative solutions as well, because I think one of the other colleagues was mentioning how we're seen as this anti-national sentiment, that covers us, that we're always against the government somehow, or, the state, or what have you. So kind of also bringing solutions to the table, but finding out a way that research has a more practical form beyond than, people just reading a policy brief and then, and then giving an implementation. Often it's about figuring out what an implementation plan would look like within the resources that, for example, maybe the government has, or we as civil society, what could we offer that could work and maybe work hand in hand. So yeah, still trying to figure out what kind of model could it be, but still very much in the camp of, okay, this broad camp of what we call think tank.
Yeah, and it might, once you figure it out, once you have it, you have to look at it and say, well, is this a think tank, or is this something new? Is this an innovation? Anybody else? Or anybody that is convinced, yes, this is the right thing for me to do, and because there's no other way. Marcel?
Thank you. Yeah, I think in our group it was rather not the question, do I still want to be working in a think tank or establishing a think tank, but very much rather what kind of think tank. What are the different aspects of think tanking that are needed, or what that correspond to what I perceive as the benefit that I could bring with that, or the market gap that I'm trying to fill. So that was very much the discussion in our group.
Great. So not whether a think tank, but what kind of think tank. And I think you'll realize that these organizations evolve, right? So the kind of think tank you are working in today might not look like the same think tank in 5 years' time. The context might force it to change. The leadership might change it. New generation of researchers might change it, etc. So I think it's worth taking that into account. Let me move on to the next series of questions, and then we'll have a chance to talk about it. Maria asked me, I'd like to hear your thoughts too. What would an alternative to think tanks be? So I think I referred to that a little bit. So if you have a very clear objective that you want to change one thing, maybe a campaign is the best way forward. Maybe working with civil society organizations, social movements, and other groups, citizens groups, to bring about a very specific change. A national campaign is the best way. If there's enough research out there already about this particular issue, then you can use other people's research, develop the right messages, develop the right communication strategies, and try to bring about that change. Might be a bit of lobbying, in fact, good intended lobbying of policymakers. If you want to do research, if you want to be a researcher, then you might want to pursue more academic career and working in an organization that is going to put pressures on you to communicate the work you do, to advocate for the work you do, to constantly fundraise to do more of that work might not be the best place for you. I often used to struggle with researchers who said to me, "Oh, but I have a PhD." I said, "Sure, but doesn't mean anything. In a think tank, you need to learn to write something in 2 days, not in 2 years. You need to decide that 5 papers is enough to read, right? Even if you could read 20 papers or 50 papers, you have to choose those 5 papers. I talk to Christina about this all the time, right? Good enough. So this might not be for everybody, right? And so I think that I would suggest think hard about this. And then Pamela, you say knowledge is bureaucratic, and that is why I'm attracted to work for think tanks. Yes, and I hope let's hope that think tanks can stay unbureaucratic, but they can easily become very, very bureaucratic themselves. So the grass is always greener somewhere else, I say. So let me keep going. And as I said, I'm gonna talk about a few things. I'm not gonna dwell on all of those the same amount of time, but do stop me. Do let me know if you want to talk about something a little bit more. Sorry, did somebody say something?
Yeah, very briefly, Enrique. Well, we are on this subject of like, if you are not a think tank, what else you would do? One reflection I wanted to give, and this is coming from IDRC, which we're not a think tank, or if we are, we were a long time ago, and we were more bureaucratic think tank, if you want to put it that way. But our aim is to fund think tanks, and we do ask the question of whether in my case the question would be, would you fund a think tank versus other things that you could be doing? And what here is what I think the context will dictate what type of intervention you do. In some contexts, you are actually the country, the society, it could be best suited for getting into the think tank that we have all been describing or talking about today. In some contexts, this might not be the case. So that's something to bear in mind at what level your society is to take the type of think tank you want to have. Like you're talking about doing research, sophisticated research, very high level advocacy work, using certain fundraising mechanisms that we have heard during the school. All these things might become in certain contexts, but not in others. So so that's something that is important. It's not only the think tanks respond to the context also dictates what is possible. Now, I'm a little bit here today, kind of on behalf of some of our attendees from Myanmar who are unable to join because the internet has been shut down. Well, that in itself, it tells you a little bit the type of context where life for a think tank could be really hard. You get cut off literally. So in those very harsh environments, a think tank might not be the way to go. I mean, we do want to believe that it is still the way to go. I am a firm believer that it is. These think tanks which are emerging, they need to be supported. The government will not do it. So other philanthropists or foundations need to do that to fill in that gap. Now, the question to conform to what else, if you cannot do think tank, what else you could do? It could be working more with a small civil society. Some civil society really aims or aspires to be a think tank. They still don't really conduct a lot of research. So that would be an area where we could be working more. Or in some cases is working with universities. In a context like Myanmar, the system has actually destroyed the university system. They make sure that nobody thinks about policy, that the educational system is really crushed as much as possible. So maybe that would be an area where you can support some possibilities of change. But it could be in very harsh environments. If it continues under the dictatorship, this might be really possible to do. A lot of the think tanks emerge because they're bringing elements from the outside into a very harsh environment, and they try to flourish. And if the environment is very harsh, you might not flourish. So I just wanted to give that reflection about the context again.
Thank you, Edgar. You might want to look at the history of think tanks in Chile, because with the Pinochet government in Chile, think tanks, researchers fled academia that was being targeted, because in academia, researchers were thinking about more fundamental things. They were thinking about rights. They were thinking about kind of the nature of the state. But when they moved to think tanks, they took on a much more technocratic approach. They looked at evidence-informed policy in a very narrow sense. So they were not addressing ideological questions, they were addressing technical questions. And this was allowed under the Pinochet government, just as it is allowed in most non-democratic states, Vietnam, in China, in most of the world. You'll find that even in Venezuela, you'll find that there's some space for technical advice, where you can challenge the technical nature of the policy, but not the fundamental nature of the policy, not what's behind it. And in Chile, the story is that think tanks were not just a place for them to do this, but think tanks were a safe house for researchers and for their ideas, right? So it was either exile, death, or the think tank, which was seen as a place where the International Development Corporation was present, and so you had to keep it to some extent safe, leave it there. And then 20 years later, they were part of the movement that brought about democracy. Anyway, let me move on, because otherwise I'll be rushing through the rest of my presentation. So, what questions? These are many questions that we should be addressing. What is the context? And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but you need to ask yourselves questions about your context, right? Setting up a think tank or deciding what kind of model your think tank should pursue, whether this is from scratch or reforming the think tank, you need to think hard about the context in which you are working. Everything from assessing the demand for evidence in your context, to looking at the competition out there or potential partners, right? You're not alone. You are part of an ecosystem, and you should make sure that you are very much aware of who is in that space. But I think you also need to take into account things that might be more macro, the level of freedom, but also things that might be more micro, right? Is this a good city to have a think tank in? Do we have internet access? What about the education policy of the country? Does that mean we have a lot of graduates sort of lying around, waiting to be hired for the think tank? Or is it going to be very hard to get those researchers that we need? What is the culture like here? I was at an event over the week on public policy in Iran, and people were talking about the hierarchy of think tanks. And so in some societies, think tanks are very hierarchical organizations because societies are hierarchical. And I think that gets in the way of the necessary dynamism that you need within a think tank. Right? So ask yourself a lot of questions about your context, as many as you can, so that you can identify the niche your organization can inhabit. What does a think tank want to achieve? I think that's a key question for us to ask ourselves. Do we have a vision? What is your dream of that ideal world, that big picture that you would like the think tank to contribute towards? What is your mission? What is your raison d'etre? What are you going to do to achieve that mission or to contribute to the achievement of that mission? What are the issues you're going to be working on? What are the issues you're going to tackle? How focused are you going to be? I don't know if you remember in my first presentation, I showed you that most think tanks in the world focus on 1, 2, maybe 3 issues at most, not everything, right? So maybe you want to start with a few things or just one thing, or maybe you want to focus your entire career, your entire history and your entire organization in one thing, and just be the one, that make sure that one thing is your intellectual territory and nobody else is allowed to come in. So have a lot of clarity about your purpose, your objectives. I often find that think tanks don't have this. They work on anything and everything that comes their way. Sometimes because the business model demands they do, but sometimes because they haven't thought about this long and hard. So don't, and in thinking about what you want to achieve, don't limit yourself on just policy recommendations. Making sure that governments use our ideas. So you might have different influencing objectives. You might want to make sure that a problem is well defined in the policy agenda. Right? You're not looking for a solution here; you're just looking at problem definition. You might the public and other stakeholders to be well informed about a key policy or a key policy discussion. You might want policy actors to have the skills to understand and use research to inform the decision. So not just your research, but anybody's research. So you might have different influencing objectives. They all fit within the different functions of a think tank. And some of them might be more urgent at different points of time, right? So if nobody cares about research, then or nobody knows how to use research in the ministry you're working with, then maybe you should be focusing on building that capacity first before trying to influence them in using your research. And I encourage you to have a look at the mission examples of existing think tanks. What language do they use? How do they focus their work? What kind of things they say they're going to do? Because it might help you also compare, contrast, think, are we more like these kind of think tanks? Are they more like us? And you might find organizations you can learn from in terms of how they implement those missions. Sorry, let me open my chat window in case any of you is asking a question, and my participants window in case any of you raise your hand. What is your business model? This is a key question that you have to address, and this is going to change along the way. This is how an organization goes about achieving your goal. This is how you deliver value to your stakeholders. how you entice funders to pay for that value, how you convert those payments of funding that they give you into research with the potential to inform policy, to influence practice, etc. Right? That's your rationale, your logic. And it's not something that you should just copy paste into your organization. I think you have to ask yourself questions about this. What is your value proposition? What are you offering your different users, internal and external? What are you going to do to create that value? Who's going to lead this organization in the way it creates value? Who's going to own the think tank and it's going to be responsible for what the think tank says it's going to do? So all of these are dimensions of the business model. And as you see, they cover all the things we talked about throughout the week. Right? So think about the last 2 weeks. Think about everything we've discussed as being a component or components of your business model. Right? Sometimes people don't like the phrase business model, but because it feels too business-like. But this is what it is, and you can think about another expression. And of course, don't limit yourself to one type of think tank, because there are many. You've discussed this, you've learned about this by talking to each other. There are many options that you can pursue. Be open about the possibilities, and think about that. Depending on the kind of think tank you are, you're going to be connected to other types of organizations, whether it's political parties, academic institutions, media, campaigning groups, public bodies. And your relationship with them is going to evolve over time, and it's going to be often dictated by their own perception of the roles you play. Right? So be aware that whatever model you choose, whatever type of organization you choose to be, you're going to be connected. You're going to be related to other organizations, more so than others. And finally, your business model is not static. And I like to share the case of Espacio Público in Chile, that in 2013, they had 100% core funding. And by 2015, they had 80% core funding, 20% project funding. And then after a year of change, they went to 2017, and the funding model had changed completely. They had 20% core funding and 70% project-based funding, with 10% of that being local funding. So they realized they couldn't sustain a core funding model, and they decided to switch completely and change to a project funding model. So you can do it, right? It's possible. You need leadership, of course, and determination to do it. But the case study is on our website, and you can find it in this link in the presentation. I know if I will share it with you in the Slack later. And then there are a series of who questions, and I think these are probably some of the most important ones, and we tend to forget about them. Who will govern, and how will they govern? Who will own the organization, and how will they express that ownership in the organization? And the best way to think about it is the board. Who's going to be in the governing board? Who's going to be in the executive direction? I think think tanks leave this to the end when they're running, and then they start thinking, okay, who's going to be keeping an eye out for the future of the organization, and it's a little bit too late. There are pros and cons of different models, and I encourage you. I think this is in the background notes, and I encourage you to explore the different pros and cons of different types of governance models in a think tank. You might be able to combine different types of boards, corporate boards with secondary boards, membership boards with secondary boards. Will give you a lot of flexibility. So I'm not going to go into the detail, but do explore these issues, because are going to give you a lot of advantages over other organizations. And the same as the business model, the governance of an organization is going to evolve. So don't worry too much about getting it right the first time around, right? If you feel your board is not delivering every service, every support that your leaders need, the organization needs, well, you can change it, you can reform it. Think tanks over time are actually quite dynamic, quite fluid, quite evolving organizations, more so maybe than academia, more so than others that have certain sort of rigidity in the definition of what kind of organization they are. Now, this is another question for you. who will lead? And I'd like to ask you, based on what we discussed, what are the desired skills in think tank leaders? So if you go to Menti, again, it's the same code. I've listed a series of sort of a list of leadership skills or qualities, and I'd like you to organize them in a level of preference or priority for you. Can we do that? I'm gonna switch to that other screen so we can have a look. So these are some skills that we've sort of collected from presentations, from discussions, from conversations in the past. You might have more, but I just want to get a sense of what you think which you think are the most important. Mobilize people seems to be at the top. A deep understanding of think tanks, imaginative and innovative. Empower people, empower a team, still at the top. Good management skills coming up, knowledge of the context coming up. Mobilizing resources seems to be middle of the table. Understanding of think tanks are falling all the way to the bottom. Knowledge of the context still at the top. Management skills, can mobilize resources. Where is knowledge of the topics? That's 7th. Good communication skills, interesting, at the bottom. Can commit to run the think tank full time, at the bottom. Okay, is that almost everybody? That's interesting. So good management skills. So I'm glad to see good management skills at the top. I'm very glad to see the ability to mobilize people to join him or her and empower a team to deliver an organization mission. I think that's crucial. I like to see knowledge of the context at the top as well, imagination and innovation, mobilizing resources, middle of the table, important, and understanding of think tanks. I'm surprised to see good communication skills at the bottom. I think, in my view, I think this is an important quality, but if you're able to mobilize others to communicate on behalf of the think tank, then this should not be a problem, because you'll be doing what Simon Maxwell did very well. He was a great communicator, but he was also a great empowerer of others. And to some extent, if you're good mobilizing people, you're also a good communicator. You can't convince people to go out there and give a presentation to a room full of experts if you're not a good communicator. If you're not, you can't be a good manager, I think, if you're not good at communicating, and it's hard to mobilize resources if you can't communicate. So to some extent, you're recognizing some of that. So, but I'm sure that if we compared all the answers, we wouldn't have something very similar. Some of you might still feel that there are certain skills that are more preferable in leaders than others. But certainly, it's interesting to see the importance of all those other things rather than just being an expert in the field, and that's something that I'm happy to emphasize. Another who question is who will listen. Don't forget about your audiences. Don't start doing research until you know who is going to be reading, listening, watching what comes out of that research. Think tanks tend to do this. They think like a researcher. What am I interested in? What do I want to do? What kind of publication do I want to put out there? And then they think, is anybody going to read this? But that's the wrong approach. You have to start with your audience. What do they want? What do they need? You have to remember that research uptake is not always up. So that's research is not always uptake. Yes. So impact is not always uptake. That's a typo, right? So it's not just to politicians, not just to analysts and advisors. Your audiences actually might be unexpected. It might be business leaders. It might be the beneficiaries of public programs. It might be other researchers, other organizations. It might be the media. It might be the public. So don't forget that your audiences are very diverse. Critical, who will work in a think tank? We did some work in Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, and one of the things we found there is that there were very few researchers out there. Right, university systems had not invested in having enough graduates to go into the public sector, into the private sector, to civil society and think tanks. And so it's very hard for think tanks to retain and to keep very good researchers. And they were very expensive, and this made the think tank almost unsustainable. But also remember that you don't just need good researchers. Sure, you need researchers in your organization, but you also need good managers, and you need excellent communicators. You might not get them to be all the same, but you might need to build teams around those key skills. A think tank with great researchers will go nowhere if it doesn't have good managers and good communicators as well. And you're going to have to think about, who are these people? Where are they? How are they going to bring them to work in my organization? Who will fund the organization? This is a question that we need to ask ourselves all the time. And there are many ways of generating income. So don't narrow yourselves, don't sort of corner yourself by thinking, oh, I need to go for core. I need to go for long-term programmatic. Yes, you need to go for those things. But there are many other options: paid membership, paid courses, publication sales, membership services. If you have space, rent out some of that space, provide research consultancy to others, private sector, public sector. Think about innovative ways in which you might be able to get funding. If there's no culture of philanthropy in your country, maybe your diaspora in the US or in the UK, where there is a culture of philanthropy, might be interested in supporting your work. Why not reach out to them? CPEC, I don't know if Nico Ducotec talked about this, but at CPEC, they started doing a lot of this. They had these annual galas in Madrid and Miami, I believe, and they were capturing the Argentinian diaspora. But maybe the Argentinians were not used to donating money to civil society organizations in Argentina, but in the US, this is quite common. Their colleagues were doing this, so well, maybe I'll do it. But why should I donate to a US charity? Why don't I donate to an Argentinian charity? So if you create the mechanism for them to do it, you might end up raising a lot more resources than you think. But key thing to know is, if you don't ask for money, nobody will give it to you. So think about who's going to fund me. What do they want to fund? Learn about them, approach them, try to think like them, and then approach them again and again. Nicolas already talked about this. There's this approach, this long-term approach of building your network to make sure people know who you are before you ask for money. Funders like to know who you are before you ask them for money. The same thing, you should know them before you start asking for resources, but don't forget to ask. Now, those are the who questions. Does anybody have any question, any comment, anything you might want to add, please? Before I go into the next one, the how questions.
Yes, and I think that a very important who for in setting up the think tank is who can be your coach in the process. I think that I've gradually during my life I've moved from the how approach, let's say, learning and try to do it by myself and try that a team I put together do things, to the who approach, which is I want to make the connections and make them work with my team. That increases the speed and efficiency in which you can set up business, set up both for profit, non-for-profit, and I think that's very important to put in the scope.
Yes,
I think we can rely each other between think tanks, between think tankers, and share a lot of things, and I think that's very important because in our context, for example, it's not easy to find, for example, a communication leader that has a very good understanding on what is a think tank. So it would be difficult to set up that team and take you a lot of time to do it. So I think that relying on this concept of the who approach, who can help me in which time, sharing things, sharing tools, sharing experiences, doing coaching, doing consulting is very, very, very important to put in the scope.
That is an excellent addition to my presentation. Thank you very much. Yes, who's going to help you? Who's going to be your coach, your mentor, your peer? I always advise when you're setting up a board of directors, don't just fill it up with people who know the subject. That's what your researchers are there for. Make sure you've got on that board. Make sure you have people who know about finance, who know about HR, who know about politics of the country, who know about fundraising, who know about marketing and communications, who know about governance of civil society organizations, for example. They might have been the directors of another NGO. Invite Simon Maxwell to sit in your board, and so every time you have a problem, you can call him and say, Simon, I have a problem. I've been eating pizza and this has happened. What do I do? So use these connections, these networks, and bring them into your organization as much as possible. But if you cannot do it in a formal way, then this network, this community that we have here, and that you have with past with alumni of the OTT school and with us and others. Exactly. Thank you, Carlos. This is it's an excellent contribution. Who are you going to be working with? And I recognize that in some parts of the world, we were talking to one of the leaders of a think tank in the Caribbean. I think they're based in Jamaica, and she was saying, I feel a little bit on my own. Like there aren't really that many think tanks in my island and in my islands. So who do I work with? And so by joining more of a global community, you might end up having peers, not just in your own country, but beyond. So thank you very much. Let me keep going. Andreas reminding me of time, and I don't want to rush too much. So how questions? How are we going to do this, right? Remember, if we were doing a planning session, and we talked about what are we going to do? Everybody would start listing things they want to do, and what I was trying to say is don't rush into what do I want to do. Start thinking about the kind of organization, the context, the kind of organization you want to have, your audiences, the people that are going to potentially work with you, and then go to the how. How are you going to do these things you want to do? Because you might end up kind of chasing an impossible strategy if you just jump straight into the how. So how are you going to do the research? That's a key question. Are you going to do it with in-house researchers, or are you going to use a network model? Are you going to have kind of solo model type of researcher that is going to be going to have 4 or 5 very senior researchers that do all the work? Are you going to want to work in teams? What kind of research are you going to do? Who is this research going to be for? These are questions you need to ask yourself to decide how you will be doing this research. And therefore, you have to think about how to make sure the research you do is policy relevant or is relevant to different audiences, right? It's not just research, but it's a particular type of research. It has to be embedded in the context. It has to respond to policy questions and objectives. It has to be fit for purpose, and it has to be timely. So these are specific questions about the kind of research that think tanks tend to do that you might not ask yourself if you were working in an academic institution or in a campaigning NGO. So think about the framework you're going to use to guide the direction of your research efforts, or any help that you're going to need, and your research agenda is going to help communicate the objective of your expertise. And research agendas are going to also help to focus your efforts and articulate initiatives around your goals. So having an agenda for some think tanks is the end of it, but it's really just a guidance, just a framework that is going to help you to navigate through what is going to be a very difficult balance to strike between what you want to do and the money that is available for you to do those things. So the agenda is going to help, but it's not necessarily everything you'll do. And you'll need to follow the sort of processes like this ones, right? Constantly brainstorm, engage, change the agenda, communicate your agenda. This is not a linear, even though I've presented it in a linear way, but it's a cyclical process. You're constantly going to have to be engaging with your audiences with your agenda. This is what we plan to study. Is this the right thing? Yes. Is this the right thing? No, no longer. If the context has changed, I'm not interested in this anymore. So you have to reflect on this all the time. You have to remember that research questions are not the same as policy questions, right? A policymaker might ask you about the skills that need to be developed to take advantage of the rise of new trading opportunities, for example. And you might end up having to do a lot of research on competition, on different sectors, on future trading opportunities, international policy changes, trade policies. But in fact, the kind of policy advice you're going to provide is more on education policy, because you're going to be informing the Ministry of Education about the kind of skills they have to build in universities or technical institutions or in secondary education. And so a research question coming from Minister of Trade or Minister of Education might send you to another sector and then back through unexpected pathways. Right? So you have to remember that the research question is not the same as the policy question. Carlos says, is it research agendas or thinking agendas? Yes, you can think about that as well. Also, think of that research quality is not the same for different kinds of organizations, right? You have to make sure that you have an agreement within your organization about what is good enough quality, right? What is the quality that you're aiming for different types of work? And quality is going to be related to credibility. Andrea, I think, shared something on the subject. Credibility is really in the eye of the beholder. Right? Your research quality is fundamental, but much more important are credentials and authority, your networks, the perception of intellectual autonomy, the way you communicate your work, your past impact, the ideologies and values that you hold, the context in which you are working. So these things are going to be affecting everything you do. As much as you work on research quality, many other factors will affect the impact you have. Then how are you going to communicate? Again, you have to go back to the questions about who, right? Who has to read, who has to listen, who has to watch the work that we do. Think about how to communicate at the start of each project. Think about what you're trying to achieve with your work. What does success look like for you? Is it important to think about? It is important to think about the start of the project, because it's going to help you think about your communications and also to think about choosing the right outputs. And I think this is one of the things that I feel defines a successful think tank, or a think tank that is trying to be successful. That they're not compartmentalizing research and communication, that they're bringing it together as one of the same. They're not evaluating the impact of comms vis-a-vis the impact of research. They're evaluating the impact of the entire effort, because both of them have to work together. This is something that I think is happening more and more. This is from Cass from Clay, a communications company, and I really like this. So they're challenging us to think about our communication approaches. And they argue the old-fashioned policy communication model. You do research, you produce a report, and then you create all these other outputs, launch an event, briefing meeting, video, tweets. But now they say, you don't do it this way. You do the research, you create a story. The story, that's the thing you're going to communicate. Then you decide how you communicate that story in the best possible way to different audiences. And it could be a report, it could be an event, it could be a summary, it could be a video, it could be a tweet, it could be all of the above. But you need to have the story at the center. So how you communicate is changing all the time, and this is one of the most recent changes. At OTT, we talk about communications as an orchestra. And what we tend to argue is that you can't really guarantee policy impact. All you can do is maximize your opportunities to influence by making sure that your music is playing in the background as long as possible. Right? So you think about this, the role of a communication director is the role of a conductor, making sure that your different instruments are playing the same music, and that you're playing the music in a way that keeps your audience engaged throughout. Not at the end of the project like we do now, where we publish everything when we're done, but throughout the project, so that during the project, at the end of the project, and after the project, you're still communicating your ideas, because you don't know when that window of opportunity is going to open, right? So this is why it's so important to think about communications in an integral way, to think about communication resources, to have a strong team, and to make sure that communication itself has leadership, that they have a kind of a life of their own. They can continue to communicate even if the researchers are no longer working on these issues. Any questions about the how, right? So I've talked about, I kind of emphasized research and communications, but of course, we could be talking about how to hire, we could be talking about how to govern, how to manage, how to raise funds, et cetera, right? So there are many other questions around how that we can address. But I think it's important that you ask these questions when you have a sense of what kind of organization you are, what kind of organization you want to be, who are the people that are going to work in this organization, or who are working in this organization already. You know, who are we? This idea of branding that Soapbox shared. You know, what's our identity? And based on that, I think we can start to think about how to do things and what's the best approach to do them. And then the when questions. When should we, if you were about to start a think tank, when should I start a think tank? Our advice is to start now. Our advice is to start before you ask for funding. So if you were in an existing organization and you want to launch a new project, I see a lot of the time organizations say, this is a great idea. I think we should do new research in this theme. Nobody's doing it. There's a need to do some work here. Okay, let's put together a project. And then they go out and they ask for money to develop the project. But funders might say, well, okay, but have you done anything about it? And I think you can do a lot before you start asking for funding. I think you can start doing a literature review, for example. I think you can set up a Twitter account that is looking at this specific issue. You can start a series of Twitter conversations. You can compile, you can do events. You can start to work on an issue, on a problem, to build a reputation in the field, build a reputation on the issue. Using a lot of the tools you've heard about in the last couple of weeks before you start asking for funding. It's a way of showing that you already exist. So funders might be risk averse. If you're a new organization, they might say, well, I don't want to fund a new organization. I don't know who they are. I don't know who their staff is. I don't know what their work is. So you need to think about, what can I do? What can I put out there? What can I publish? What can I communicate? So that funders might think I am bigger than I am, or I am more established than I am, or I am actually quite committed to developing this. So we advise, if you're reading stuff, you're reading articles, papers, books on a particular issue, publish what you read. Publish a summary of something you've read. Publish a tweet highlighting an idea, a Facebook post highlighting an idea about something you've read. So create a space for yourselves. Publish other people's work and other people's idea if you agree with those ideas and that work. Don't limit yourselves to simply publishing your own papers. Why don't you use other people's work and say, well, this is an interesting study from the World Bank, or this is an interesting study from this other think tank. We agree with this. We are going to share it with our network, with our audience. If you are an academic and you're setting up a think tank, or you're moving from a think tank to another think tank, use the research you've done before to build your body of work in your own organization. And don't be afraid to publish preliminary ideas. I think one of the beautiful things about working in a think tank is that you can take the idea of the working paper more seriously. You can say this is work in progress. You can organize an event to say, we don't know the answer, but we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to have a conversation about what the answer might be. So give it a go. And with that, I had not group work, but really just a discussion. So I should have taken out that slide. But I want to have a final discussion with all of you before you move on to a session where you might discuss this again. But this is specifically in relation to what we've talked about. What are you going to do next? And this is for everybody. I really want to encourage everybody to say something, or we won't have time for everybody, but to say something if you can, or to write something in the chat. So if you don't mind, let's use the chat option now. and I want you to write, what are you going to do next? And then raise your hand, and I'm going to give you, Eduardo, I see you raise your hand. I want to give you the microphone. But everybody else, please write something in the chat. What are you going to do next? And it could be, I'm just going to relax, not think about think tanks for a while. And it could be, I'm going to take this particular idea. I'm going to discuss this with my colleagues. I am going to start planning. I like to hear from you which of these questions you might want to tackle next. Eduardo, you want to go first, and then Pamela.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think I will go back to the material on the lectures of this course and trying to, I like to have the full picture of things. So, and I feel this is a very short time, but it's a lot of things to learn. So I want to get to know more and to read it and to, well, that's it. And talk with my colleagues as well.
Great, yes, chew all the material and then digest it. Take your time, exactly, yes. And I think everybody else is here to help you in the process. Pamela?
Thank you, Enrique. I just wanted to say, I've been following the work on think tanks since March last year when we were on lockdown. And the articles that you've written and all of that is very enlightening. The content that came out of the school, I really wish I heard it earlier rather than now, but it's not lost. I built a directory of all the links that has been shared. But for me, the biggest takeaway is your last statement. I've always had a block on taking the courage to be writing. And I think what you just said now is really motivating, because I've read a lot and on other people's views, but I think it can motivate me as a starting point to actually expand on that. And because often, there's just an overload of information, and then you're all over the place. You want to start something and then you divulge into something else. But I think just to take that last bit of advice and just write something and get into the rhythm, so that it's about sharing everything, because not everybody covers everything. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you, Pamela. It's true. Sometimes you don't need to have the whole thing designed perfectly, right? You just need to get started. And this is the same with policy influence. If you don't know what's going to have the biggest impact on your policy audiences, maybe the first thing you do, because you don't know them well, maybe the first thing you do is you put something out there and you see the reaction. And based on the reaction, you adapt your strategy, right? If people react positively, then you think, oh, this is it's a good pathway, this is a good strategy. If they react very negatively, they reject it, then, well, maybe this is not the way to go. But you're just put feelers out there. You're not going full way, but just a few bits of action that are going to help you inform the process as you go. So there's some few here that are sharing, read more in depth about storytelling. I think I really recommend it. The work of Catherine Clay is really fantastic. I really enjoy it. Brainstorming sessions, I do recommend this. If you're part of an organization, bring all of this with you. You can download it, you can share the videos, discuss it with your peers, with your teammates, have a conversation with them about these things, right? We do not have all the answers, and I think what you've heard are not all the answers either. Your peers might be able to identify different layers of the information we've provided that maybe you might have missed and we might have missed. So it's great recommendation to go and have a brainstorm, have a dialogue with your colleagues. Improve your communication strategies. It's vital to attract funding, building a reputation, etc. You're using this as you go through a restructuring of HR, establishing new lines of management. Great. Anybody else? Anybody would like to raise their hand? And Donald, you're going to boost our funding model. Yes, allow your brain to rest and make the connections and then debrief. And then one thing I would ask you all to do is to share those digested reflections with all of us. And so whatever it is that you do in your organizations, do let us know, not just us, OTT, but us, the group. do let us know what you're doing, because you might, as Carlos was saying, you might end up realizing that somebody else is doing the same thing you are. Somebody else is embarking in a similar reform, and maybe you can do it together. Maybe you can embark in that reform together, and learn from each other, help each other as you go forward. And they just told me that in the chat that she was going to ask you the same question. So this has been a bit of a trial or a warm up. So you are now warned. She's going to ask you, what are you going to do next? And some of you have already given the answer. All right, so that's it from me. As I said at the beginning, this is a slightly out of date summary of the school. It's out of date because every year the trainers and the experts we invite to join us, they come up with new ideas. They've had a whole year reflect, think about what they're going to say, come up with new cases. They faced new challenges for sure. Last year has been a year of many challenges. They've experimented, and so I'll try to update this presentation for next year. But you are all, and Andrea will repeat this again, but you're all welcome to be part of our community. We do not refer to the OTT network or the On Think Tanks network. We like to think of this as a community. So either through the newsletter, social media, the Slack channel, or email, you have our emails. Feel free to always send us an email, ask us any questions you have. We will do our best to help you find the answers to the questions you have and help you through your journeys. That is our mandate. That is our commitment to this field. And do reach out, share your experiences. The OTT platform, the website is open. If you want to write something, if you want to share a challenge, share a solution, share questions, a reflection, use it. And if you want us to share your work, anything you've done in the past, you're doing in the future, and you want others to know about, just let us know. We'll do our best to help you in your journeys and in your work.